Our story begins with Shoichiro Takahashi, a man who never considered himself to have a strong sense of justice or self-sacrifice. Yet in a split-second decision, he shoved his junior out of the path of a speeding truck, taking the full impact himself as his colleague screamed his name in a desperate plea for him to hang on. After dying, Shoichiro Takahashi found himself in a mysterious spiritual realm, where a divine voice greeted him by name and explained that his life had been reviewed, noting it was completely average right up until his final, heroic act of sacrificing himself for his junior. The divine voice then reveals her form as the goddess Lucia, telling Shoichiro that because he could act for others in a crucial moment, it would be a shame for him to simply disappear, so she offers him a chance to lend his strength to her world, promising to grant him special talents in return. Humbled by the grand offer, Shoichiro admitted he wasn't sure he could meet her expectations, but he resolved to accept, promising he would take things slow and give it a try. Pleased with his answer, the radiant being before him formally introduced herself, her voice echoing through the void as she revealed her name was Lucia, the manager of this world and the one once known as the goddess of creation. After revealing her incredible status, Lucia's expression softened into a gentle, almost bashful smile, her cheeks flushing slightly as she looked upon the soul she had chosen. As her gentle smile faded from view, Shoichiro's consciousness began to drift downwards into a silent, dark abyss, and with a quiet sense of finality, he calmly accepted that he really had died. But as he faded into nothingness, one final, desperate voice reached him through the void, the sound of his younger sister crying out for her big brother. Hearing her desperate cry, Shoichiro's final thoughts drifted to the present he had for his little sister, his one and only regret being that he would never get to give it to her as his consciousness shattered into nothing. But just as his consciousness shattered into nothing, he was pulled from the darkness by a desperate cry as his new younger sister, Ellie, tried to wake her brother, Rainford, from a peaceful nap in the grass. Her voice finally broke through the lingering dream of his past life, and as Rainford opened his eyes, he sleepily mumbled his sister's name before wishing Ellie a good morning. After starting his day, Rainford walks hand in hand with Ellie, his mind drifting back as he reflects that it's already been 10 long years since he first arrived in this world. He reflects on his new identity as Rainford Proudlord, the eldest son of the baronial family governing the humble Elise region, and as they walk together, his sister Ellie asks if he's going out again, to which he replies he's just taking a little walk. His little walk turned out to be a trip into the vast silver forest, a dangerous, monster-infested wasteland covering the western half of their territory, and as Rainford reflected on his new life in a medieval fantasy setting, he casually told his sister Ellie he was going out to play, who urged him to be careful before he headed straight into the dense woods. Once deep within the silver forest, Rainford decided it was time to begin his training, muttering a rite as he gathered magical energy and then unleashed it in a powerful blast, launching himself high into the air to navigate the dense woods with incredible speed. He deftly ricocheted off thick tree branches, using them like springboards to catapult himself deeper and deeper into the forest at breathtaking speeds. With a final leap, he burst from the dense canopy, landing silently in a wide, sun-dappled clearing he had chosen as his practice ground. Ready to begin, Rainford focused his thoughts on this world's 6 magical elements, confident in his rare ability to wield all of them. He then turned his attention to the massive crater he had been carving into the earth, a training area that grew larger with each session and served as a glimpse of the true power the goddess had bestowed upon him. This power wasn't limited to just carving the earth. Rainford also focused on refining his other elemental abilities, meticulously practicing his control over water by visualizing its entire life cycle, from springing in the mountains to returning to the sea and being carried up by the wind. Putting his complex understanding of the water cycle into practice, Rainford first conjured a single, potent drop of water over a seed, then proudly unleashed a powerful downpour with his hands, declaring his magical sprinkler system a complete success. However, his triumph was short-lived as Rainford realized with a start that the water was spraying everywhere, not just on his crops, prompting him to quickly devise a plan to build a divider by mixing earth and fire elements to create heat-resistant bricks. Putting his plan into action, Rainford was startled as a colossal stone wall erupted from the earth with a thunderous rumble, far exceeding his intentions. He looked at the massive structure he had accidentally created and sighed, admitting that controlling the sheer output of his power was a difficult task. The massive spell had completely drained his reserves, causing Rainford to stumble as he realized he was out of mana and needed a break. But just as he decided to rest, his head snapped up at the sound of a strange noise coming from deeper within the forest. This familiar feeling of complete mana exhaustion made Rainford pause, reminding him of his childhood when he would often push his training too hard and collapse, completely drained, amongst his books. Unlike his childhood, however, his mana capacity had grown immensely, and he quickly felt his strength returning. But just as Rainford clenched his fist, feeling recovered, a monstrous roar suddenly ripped through the quiet forest, causing him to whip his head around in alarm. Alarmed by the monstrous roar, Rainford immediately pushed through the dense undergrowth, pinpointing the direction of the sound as he cautiously moved forward. Parting the final branches, he found the source of the sound was not a monster, but a silver wolf-like creature lying on the ground, and despite its weak, menacing growl, Rainford's first thought was to wonder if it was simply a dog. That thought vanished when he got a better look, rushing forward as he realized the creature was seriously injured, and as it let out a pained whimper, Rainford's concern took over and he gently asked if it was okay. But his moment of concern was shattered as the enraged orc lunged forward, swinging a crude weapon with brutal force, aiming to eliminate both Rainford and the wolf he was trying to protect. As the ground trembled with heavy footsteps, Rainford froze behind a tree as a massive muscle-bound orc came into view, looming over the injured silver wolf with a menacing glare. Unable to stand by and watch the helpless creature, Rainford revealed himself from behind the tree, startling the small silver wolf with his sudden appearance, and before the orc could react, he launched himself forward and stomped hard, shattering the earth beneath his feet as he began to channel his magic. As the earth shattered around them, Rainford got his first proper look at the hulking beast, his eyes widening as he recognized the monstrous, tusked creature as an orc, something he had only ever read about in books. Reacting instantly to the threat, Rainford scooped up the injured silver wolf and bolted for cover behind a nearby tree, narrowly dodging the orca's brutish charge. Tucked behind the safety of the tree, Rainford checked on the small wolf, gently stroking its head to reassure the terrified creature. After calming the whimpering silver wolf, Rainford steeled himself from behind the tree, knowing that if he was going to save the creature, he had no choice but to fight the hulking orc. Stepping out to confront the orc, Rainford immediately formulated his attack by drawing on knowledge from his past life, deciding to harden and compress the earth, then heat it with fire to forge a high-density stone. He planned to then launch the projectile with incredible speed using wind magic, essentially creating a powerful, magical bullet. Putting his plan into action, Rainford poured his mana into his hands, gritting his teeth as he began to gather and compress raw earth magic into a small, glowing sphere. But the orc refused to give him a moment to prepare, rushing forward and unleashing a devastating horizontal swing with its club, aiming to pulverize Rainford before he could finish his spell. Ducking behind a tree just in time to avoid the massive club, Rainford finally completed his complex spell and with a determined cry, he fired the superheated stone bullet straight at the approaching orc. The superheated stone bullet slammed into the orc with a sickening thud, and the massive creature came crashing down right in front of Rainford, who flinched back as the ground shook from the impact before collapsing against a tree, letting out a heavy sigh of relief as he admitted how terrifying the ordeal had been. As his adrenaline finally faded, Rainford's attention was drawn to the pained whimpers of the silver wolf beside him, and with a sudden realization, he remembered he possessed healing magic. Kneeling down, he gently stroked the creature's fur, apologizing for the pain it must have endured and reassuringly told it not to worry. Placing a calming hand on the creature's head, Rainford softly told the wolf that it was okay now, and with a resolved expression, he silently vowed that he would take care of it from this point forward. Looking down at the small soot-covered creature, Rainford mused that it must have once been a beautiful fluffy pup, and then, kneeling before it, he began to channel his healing magic, determined to restore the wolf's health completely. As the warm glow of his magic faded, the suit and injuries vanished, and the now perfectly fluffy creature let out a happy yip, looking down at its pristine paws in surprise before turning back to the smiling Rainford and wagging its tail furiously with joyful barks. The creature's pure, unbridled joy was infectious, and as it began to zoom around him in circles with happy barks and howls, Rainford couldn't help but laugh along with his new friend. Holding his new companion close, Rainford beamed with relief as it affectionately licked his cheek, but his joy quickly turned to concern as he noticed the sky darkening and realized he had to hurry home before his mother got mad. Knowing he had to leave, Rainford gently set the creature down, telling Shuro he was heading home now and to be careful not to get attacked by weirdos again. With a final wave, he turned and started his journey back, leaving the small wolf to watch him depart through the woods. As Rainford began nimbly leaping through the woods, he suddenly paused, a thoughtful smile spreading across his face as he realized he wasn't alone. He turned to find the small silver wolf he had just rescued trotting eagerly behind him. With a gentle smile, Rainford asked why it was following him, but the creature only responded with a happy little whine, its tail wagging as it continued to tag along. Rainford tried to send the persistent creature away, telling the little wolf it should go back to its own family, but it only whimpered sadly and began tugging at his leg, refusing to be left behind. Faced with such a pitiful and desperate display, Rainford's resolve completely crumbled, and he couldn't help but gush over how incredibly cute the little creature was. Completely won over by the creature's charm, Rainford blushed and conceded that he really had no choice in the matter, deciding to take it home with him. Acting on his decision, Rainford hoisted the little wolf into the air and asked if it wanted to come live with him, getting an enthusiastic bark in response. As the creature nuzzled against his cheek, he was overcome by how fluffy it was and warned it to be on its best behavior since his father was very strict about manners. Holding the fluffy creature up, Rainford decided that the first order of business for joining the family was to give it a name, and seeing its enthusiastic and adorable reaction, he happily committed to the idea. Acknowledging it was a simple choice, Rainford happily held the creature aloft and officially declared that he would call him Shiro. With his new companion officially named, Rainford decided it was time to head home, and the little wolf happily trotted along beside him as 3 months quickly passed. However, what Rainford hadn't anticipated was Shiro's explosive growth spurt, prompting him to nervously comment on the wolf's now colossal. Elsewhere, two men ventured deep into a forest at night, following a map given to them by Rainford. As one confirmed they were in the right location, their torchlight suddenly illuminated the object of their search, a colossal, brilliantly cut jewel resting on the ground, leaving them momentarily speechless. Back at the Proudlord estate, Rainford presented the massive red jewel he'd acquired from his adventure. Ellie's eyes lit up, exclaiming how pretty it was, while their mother identified it as a valuable fire magic stone. As his mother marveled at the amazing find, a slightly flustered Rainford simply confirmed it, prompting Ellie to ask with wide-eyed excitement if the stone really came from the orc he had defeated. As Ellie's eyes sparkled with excitement, Rainford was struck by a thought and couldn't help but smile fondly. He realized he hadn't properly introduced the overwhelmingly cute girl before him, his beloved little sister, Elizabeth Proudlord. As Ellie finished speaking with their father, she turned to Rainford with a radiant and deeply contented smile. Completely overcome with brotherly affection, he pulled her into a tight hug, thinking to himself that she was without a doubt the cutest sister in the entire world. Just then, their father's voice called for Ellie, but instead of going to him, she turned and surprised her mother with a tight hug. As the woman exclaimed with delight, Rainford watched the sweet moment unfold from the doorway. The woman Ellie embraced was their mother, Murim Proudlord. Rainford reflected on how she used to be a renowned and powerful mage, a stark contrast to the gentle, if somewhat airheaded, mother she was today who wholeheartedly supported her husband. Inside, Ellie was still in disbelief, marveling that her brother had actually defeated such a ferocious orc. Her sentiment was shared by the household's butler, Fried, who was so overcome with pride he had to wipe away a tear. He praised the young master for becoming so admirable, a high compliment from a flawless cheat-level butler who handled every task from cooking to cleaning with perfection. And then, a new visitor arrived at the Proudlord estate. Rainford watched with a hint of apprehension as a woman with long, flowing hair stood before his entire family, her hands clasped together. Rainford had been worried that his family wouldn't accept the now colossal Shiro, but his fears were completely unfounded. To his immense relief, they welcomed the giant wolf without any fuss, with one of the household attendants even hoping Rainford would grow to be as strong and big-hearted as his new friend. Later, Rainford reported the full details of his dangerous encounter to his father, Baron Proudlord. As the Baron's expression grew increasingly grim, a worried Ellie asked why he looked so serious, and he assured her that he would explain the grave situation to everyone very soon. True to his word, Baron Proudlord began to lay out the grim details, confirming that just as Rainford had reported, they found an orc corpse and a magic stone deep in the forest. He continued that an investigation team was dispatched to the site, but they found no traces of any other orc types in the surrounding area. The father continued his report, adding that the team also discovered a massive new pond and a fortress-like wall deep in the woods. While it wasn't deemed an immediate threat, he noted the situation was still a total mystery, leaving Rainford to sweat nervously, fully aware he was the cause of it all. Turning his attention to the large magic stone Rainford had brought back, the man explained that its size and the traits described pointed to a shocking conclusion. Rainford stared back in disbelief as the man revealed that the monster he had defeated wasn't a common orc at all, but a far more dangerous, higher-tier species known as an orc king. The man urged Rainford to record this victory as his first true achievement, explaining that in the past, orc kings have been responsible for causing massive destruction across many regions. Taking in the immense gravity of his accomplishment, Rainford decided he would report the subjugation directly to the king once everything settled down. Later, as Rainford and Ellie reported the subjugation to their father, the Baron Proudlord, he gravely informed them that this was a completely different matter than a simple monster hunt. He gestured towards the massive magic stone recovered from the Orc King, explaining that a crystal of its size contained an overwhelming and dangerously potent amount of magical power. Rainford then explained his ideal solution, proposing that he could break the massive stone down into smaller pieces and distribute its power for use across their entire territory, but he trailed off, hinting at a major complication with his plan. Concluding that his own magic wasn't enough to break the stone, Rainford decided they would have to consult an expert, a blacksmith named Watts. Though he still seemed to have reservations about the idea, the person across from him simply raised a hand, accepting the proposed course of action. However, just as they settled on a plan, Rainford suddenly held up a hand, changing his mind at the last moment. He asked his companion to leave the magic stone with him instead, leaving the other person to stare back in confusion, questioning his sudden reversal. Sometime later, Rainford led his sister Ellie to a vast, barren wasteland on their family's land. Seeing the desolate expanse, Ellie turned to him with a curious expression, asking if this was really the place where he intended to use the magic stone. Rainford confirmed her suspicions, explaining his plan to build an irrigation system right there in the barren wasteland. Ellie was immediately skeptical, reminding him that they had tried to develop the land many times before, but the soil was too hard and they could never find a water source. Unfazed by her doubt, Rainford simply gave a confident smile, ready to reveal how he would solve that very problem. With a knowing grin, Rainford revealed his grand solution to the water problem, confidently declaring that he was going to build a dam. Ellie, however, reacted to his confident proclamation with stunned disbelief, questioning the very idea of building a dam. Rainford explained his grand idea for a massive dam that could store water, but his father, Baron Proudlord, was quick to point out the fatal flaw. While agreeing it would be a dream come true for their land, he noted there were no water veins in the area to supply it. With that, the Baron regretfully stated they had no choice but to abandon the project, leaving Rainford looking utterly dejected. Refusing to let his father's dream die, Rainford suddenly presented a massive magic stone, offering it as a solution. He looked on anxiously as a hand reached out and a voice asked to borrow the stone, his bold plan now hanging in the balance. With his father's hesitant agreement, Rainford clutched the large magic stone and moved forward. As his father called out his name in concern, Rainford warned him to keep a safe distance, explaining that what he was about to attempt was dangerous. With his warning delivered, Rainford held the magic stone steady and began to pour his energy into it, causing the massive crystal to immediately pulse with a brilliant light and a deep, resonant hum. As Rainford poured his mana into the stone, it pulsed violently, stunning the man watching as the crystal's color abruptly shifted from fiery red to a deep, aquatic blue, causing liquid magic to swirl through the air. With a serene smile, Rainford confirmed that he had shifted the crystal's very attribute from fire to water, a feat that left the man beside him completely dumbfounded. Having finished the first test, Rainford then turned to his father, who was standing further away, and prepared for the next challenge, calmly warning him to be careful as the upcoming display of power would make the ground itself tremble. Completely dumbfounded by his son's warning, Rainford's father nervously asked what more he could possibly be planning, as Rainford planted his foot firmly on the ground in preparation. As he braced himself, Rainford's mind suddenly flashed back to the one time he truly faced death, recalling the powerful thoughts that flooded his mind in that critical moment. He remembered everyone he was leaving behind, his work, the subordinate he had shielded, his family, and his beloved sister. As these final thoughts flooded his mind, his very consciousness began to dissipate, slipping away from his grasp as his world faded to black. As his consciousness dissipated, his final thought took shape, wondering aloud if he could be reborn. In that instant, he was yanked backwards into a swirling vortex of raw power, a spell cast by the goddess Lucia herself. As the goddess's spell took hold, a wave of pure elation washed over him. With a look of sheer, manic joy, he welcomed the eat, sleep, repeat life he had always craved, simultaneously shouting a final goodbye to the oppressive corporate world he had escaped. As he welcomed his new purpose, the goddess's gift of magic manifested with a cataclysmic explosion that shattered the very ground beneath him, and amidst the settling dust, Rainford's resolve hardened, promising himself that this time, he would finally live the carefree, laid-back slow life he so desperately wanted. The blast had permanently scarred the land, carving out new, jagged mountains under a somber sky. Rainford and Ellie eventually stood at the epicenter, dwarfed by the immense crater and taken aback by the sheer scale of destruction they were witnessing. While investigating the crater, Rainford spotted a faint glow coming from within the scorched rock and started to dig, soon uncovering a strange, multifaceted crystal that pulsed with an inner light. Rainford beamed with pride, standing beside the enormous, gleaming crystal he had just pulled from the ground, while his companion was frozen in utter shock by the impossible discovery. Rainford proudly admired his handiwork, noting that his earth magic had not only extracted the crystal but had also created a perfectly measured and rock-solid foundation, reinforced to be absolutely flawless. With his foundation work complete, an official explained to Rainford that filling the massive main channel would take 2 full days. He then laid out the grand vision: a grid of smaller channels would be linked to the rivers, ensuring a steady water supply for all the farmlands once the sluice gate was opened. Rainford's father proudly declared the massive structure a dam, a project that would make their entire territory flourish. But while Rainford took in the momentous achievement, a nearby aide stared in utter disbelief. He realized with a jolt that Rainford had been casting 2 powerful spells at the very same time to complete the work. As the aide steadied the visibly drained Rainford, his disbelief mounted over yet another impossible detail. He pressed the young lord for an explanation, demanding to know what happened to the incantation that should have been required for such powerful magic. Rainford looked utterly baffled by the question, repeating the word incantation, as if it were a completely foreign concept to him. All he could muster was a confused awe, which only seemed to leave the man holding him steady just as bewildered. Still trying to process the lack of an incantation, the man simply smiled in awe. Placing a friendly hand on Rainford's shoulder, he looked around at the massive crater and could only remark on the incredible power the boy possessed. The man's friendly awe instantly vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Rainford, completely oblivious to his shock, then asked a question that seemed to break all common sense, wondering what it even meant to change a magic stone's attribute. But as Rainford looked on, he would later reflect that at that moment, he had absolutely no idea what kind of creature he had truly brought into his life. This startling realization stemmed from an ability Shiro possessed that was considered utterly impossible in their world. The creature could actually change a magic stone's attribute, a legendary feat that no mage or scholar had ever been capable of achieving. This reminded Rainford of another impossible feat, the ability to cast multiple spells simultaneously, a power that was once said to exist only in myths and fairy tales. This legendary talent was precisely what the goddess Lucia had granted him, promising him a fair amount of magical ability for his new life. Recalling his conversation with the goddess, Rainford couldn't help but question her choice of words, mentally screaming at Lucia about what she could possibly mean by just a fair amount. His current reality was a stark contrast to the simple fundamentals he'd learned as a child. He remembered sitting in his father's study, engrossed in a book that laid out the world's magic system. It was simple enough. There were 6 attributes: fire, earth, water, wind, light, and darkness, and most people were lucky to have an aptitude for just one. At the time, that was everything he thought there was to know about magic. He recalled the common wisdom of this world: having an aptitude for 2 attributes was enough to be considered a talented magician, and those with 3 or 4 were lauded as true geniuses. This realization led Rainford to a staggering question as he stood alone with his thoughts. He wondered if it was possible that he possessed an aptitude not just for a few, but for every single magical attribute. The sheer scale of Rain's aptitude sent his guardian into a state of shock, leaving the man to agonize over how he could possibly report such a monumental talent to the king. In stark contrast, Rain's mother simply smiled with pride, telling her son she always knew he could use magic, while Rain himself looked utterly bewildered by the unfolding events. As his mother's praise continued, she called his display of power simply amazing, but Rain could only manage a strained, awkward smile, still trying to process everything that had just happened. As his mother looked on in stunned disbelief, another young woman celebrated, exclaiming that Rain possessed an incredible level of talent, forcing the overwhelmed woman to sigh and try to convince herself there was no point in worrying about it. While his mother resigned herself to the situation, Rain's father, the Lord of Clayford, grappled with the political implications, knowing he couldn't simply hide such immense power from the king. After considering his options, he decided to prioritize his son's safety for now, declaring that the matter of Rain's official magical status would be put on hold. The Lord of Clayford tried to process the sheer scale of what he'd witnessed. Rain's ability to use non-verbal magic and weave together composite spells from multiple attributes was beyond anything he'd ever seen, leading him to a single staggering conclusion: his son's talent was utterly immeasurable. Rainford, however, was already contemplating the dangerous political fallout of his gift. He recognized that the ability to change a magic stone's attribute was a power so great that if his guardian tried to hide it, other nobles could easily accuse him of treason. Grappling with the immense political risk of Rainford's abilities, his guardian held the boy's face, his gaze intense and calculating. He decided that for the moment, the wisest course of action was simply to wait and see. Sweating profusely, Rainford could only recall the goddess Lucia's cheerful, smiling face as he sarcastically replayed her words in his head, a promise of merely certain level of talent. Deciding to set aside the overwhelming issue of Rain's divine talent for the time being, the Lord of Clayford focused on his duties. As Rain, his mother, and his sister listened, he announced that he would be traveling to the royal capital the following day to report on the new dam. He elaborated on the urgency of his trip, explaining that the new dam had caused a massive change in the terrain, which meant the local taxes would have to be completely recalculated. With such significant implications, the Lord of Clayford stated firmly that they could no longer postpone making an official report to the capital. The Lord of Clayford excitedly explained that with the new dam, their territory's crop yields would significantly increase starting the very next year, a prospect that filled Rainford with visible delight as he enthusiastically agreed. Rainford was ecstatic, certain that a bigger harvest would lead to more fertile land, bringing his dream of a relaxed, slow life within reach. But before he could finish the thought, the Lord of Clayford's serious voice cut through his celebration, signaling that his simple life would have to wait. As Rain's celebration was cut short, the Lord of Clayford leaned down with a solemn look, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He told Rain there was something he needed to ask, leaving the young lord completely perplexed by the sudden gravity of the situation. Carrying out his new task, Rain rode his companion Shiro through the town streets. The townsfolk greeted their young lord with warm smiles and hellos as he passed, and Rain happily returned their greetings, noting that Shiro was also in a very good mood. As they arrived at their destination, Rain considered the next step of his father's plan. While the new dam would successfully irrigate their soil, it presented a new problem. With the expected increase in agricultural output, they lacked the proper farm tools for cultivation. Petting Shiro, Rain remembered his specific mission was to commission this new equipment from a reclusive dwarf blacksmith living on the outskirts of the craftsman's district. Rain's guardian looked on with a slightly troubled expression as he discussed the task. He then gestured to an ornate sword mounted on the wall, explaining that he had personally asked Watts to craft it for his brother upon his succession as the new lord. To demonstrate the dwarf's legendary skill, his guardian unsheathed the ornate sword with a smooth ring of steel. Rain could only stare in wide-eyed admiration, captivated by the flawless weapon as he remarked on what an amazing piece of work it was. His guardian confirmed the blacksmith's skill was top-notch but warned Rain that the man was also quite eccentric, a trait he chalked up to the dwarven temperament. This mention of a true craftsman triggered a flashback to Rain's previous life, where he'd had a nearly identical conversation about another master artisan while sitting at a bar. His father then placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder, formally giving him his next mission. With the new dam set to improve their crop yields, he needed Ryan to personally visit the eccentric blacksmith and commission a new set of cultivation tools for the territory. However, the eccentric blacksmith was even more difficult than anticipated. The man, who reeked of alcohol and had a terrifying aura, slammed the door in Rain's face without even listening to his request. Reeling from the rejection, Rain took a moment to compose himself, strengthening his resolve by reminding himself that this was all for the sake of his slow life. With the door slammed shut in his face, Rainford composed himself and called out anyway. He introduced himself as a messenger from Clayford, politely asking if the man behind the door was indeed the blacksmith, Master Watts. The door creaked open again and a gruff voice asked what he wanted. The blacksmith, a large and imposing dwarf named Watts, peered out. Spotting Ranford's noble attire, he grunted for the boy to hurry up and get inside, swinging the door wide open for the startled visitor. Rain was left utterly speechless by the blacksmith's condition. He had to purify all of the iron in the entire workshop, a task that made his goal of a peaceful, slow life seem like a distant, impossible dream. His mind still reeling from the blacksmith's absurd condition, Rain followed Watts into a storeroom that was an absolute disaster zone. As he stepped carefully through the doorway, the dwarf gruffly warned him not to trip over the mountain of junk scattered across the floor. Once inside the chaotic storeroom, Watts cut straight to the point, bluntly asking Rain what his business was. A bit startled, Rain held out a sealed letter, explaining that all the details of his request were written inside. Watts took the letter and broke the seal as Rain nervously explained the request to commission iron tools for cultivation. The grizzled blacksmith's eyes narrowed as he read, repeating the words with a skeptical and dismissive, "Ah." Watts's dismissive tone quickly erupted into a full-blown roar as he slammed his fist down, yelling at the startled Rain not to be an idiot. The gruff blacksmith explained that the request was incredibly difficult, stressing that you couldn't forge proper cultivation tools from just any scrap iron. But as Rain processed the outburst, a single thought gave him a glimmer of hope. Watts had said it was hard, not impossible. Undeterred, Rain expressed his disappointment, mentioning the magnificent sword he knew Watts had forged for his father. He reasoned that if the blacksmith could create such a masterpiece, he could surely handle making some sturdy farm tools, a point that clearly caught the gruff dwarf by surprise. His initial skepticism vanished as he examined the metal Rain had created. Watts corrected himself in awe, realizing this wasn't just any iron, but perfectly forged iron, a material of extraordinary quality. Watts, however, immediately shut Rain down, declaring he wouldn't waste his time on foolish blacksmithing work. Clenching his fist, the dwarf explained that he would only forge with a material of exceptional quality, a kind of metal that was nearly impossible to find. Unfazed by the blacksmith's refusal, Rain decided on a new approach and politely asked Watts if he could see his workshop, as Shiro quietly chimed in with a plea to see just a little bit. Watts granted his request, allowing Rain to step into his workspace. It was the very image of a dwarven forge, complete with a large furnace, sturdy workbenches, and tools of all shapes and sizes laid out with meticulous care. As Rain took in the impressive setup, he quietly remarked that this was indeed the master's workshop. Stepping further inside, Rain was immediately struck by the contrast. While the front room was a mess, the workshop was impeccably clean, which told him that the master blacksmith was itching to get back to work. Rain's assessment was spot on. The workshop was the epitome of organization. Massive hammers hung neatly on the wall above a well-maintained forge, and every single tool was laid out on the workbench with meticulous care, proving this was the space of a true master craftsman. Stepping firmly onto the stone floor, Rainford entered the impeccably organized space, his arrival marked by a solid thud. Rainford presented his request for new farming tools, but the master blacksmith Watts immediately dismissed the idea. He bluntly stated that the iron they had available was of such poor quality that he simply couldn't make the tools they needed. Unimpressed, Watts waved him off, telling Rain to just go home since he wasn't motivated to work with such poor materials. But instead of leaving, Rain simply picked up a block of the crude iron as a powerful magical aura erupted around him. The startled blacksmith could only stare, demanding to know what on earth the boy was trying to do. As his magic flared, Rain's mind flashed back to his previous life, remembering how he'd once researched iron refining purely for curiosity's sake. A plan began to form. If he could perfectly visualize the magnificent sword his father owned, he could use his power to reproduce it directly from the crude block of iron. Putting his plan into motion, Rein focused his energy on the crude block of iron, using heart magic to melt and reduce the metal with intense heat before preparing wind magic to vaporize the remaining impurities. As this impossible process began right before his eyes, the master blacksmith Watts could only watch in stunned disbelief, demanding to know what on earth the boy was doing. As the magical purification reached its climax, a powerful wave of heat erupted from the metal, forcing the stunned Watts to recoil as he shouted in alarm at the sheer intensity. Unbothered by the incredible temperature, Rein calmly held the transformed block of iron, now glowing with newfound purity. A powerful wave of heat erupted from the metal, forcing the stunned Watts to shield his face and recoil as he shouted in disbelief at the sheer intensity of the purification process. The raw magical power of the purification process was so great that it burst out of the side of Watts's workshop in a thunderous explosion. Inside the swirling dust, the magic continued its work on a microscopic level, as the impure, gritty elements within the common iron were violently targeted and ripped away by Rein's powerful spell, leaving behind a block of metal so pure it seemed to glow from within. The process complete, the newly formed block of perfectly purified steel floated gently between Rein's hands as he presented his creation, confidently asking what the blacksmith thought of it. The blacksmith, Watts, took the block of purified steel from Rein to inspect it more closely, but the moment it touched his hand, he began to tremble in disbelief at its quality. The trembling in his hands was nothing compared to the shock on his face as he realized what he was holding. He questioned if it was truly steel, before declaring that it possessed an unbelievable level of purity. Rein beamed, glad his little demonstration was a success. Seeing the blacksmith was thoroughly impressed, he politely asked if Watts would finally agree to take on the job. Instead of simply agreeing to the job, Watts stunned Rein by slamming his forehead to the ground in a desperate bow, fervently pleading with him. Rein was so taken aback by the master blacksmith's desperate groveling that he instinctively refused the request. But his rejection only fueled Watts's fervor, as the dwarf pleaded again with all his might, begging for the chance to work with the impossibly pure steel. Completely flustered by the master blacksmith's groveling, Rein pleaded for Watts to stand up. He tried to downplay his achievement by suggesting it might be an easy task for him too, but Watts immediately refused the notion, already lost in a passionate daze, wondering what incredible masterpieces they could forge from such a perfect material. As a nervous Rein looked on, Watts leaned over the gleaming metal, his voice filled with the passion of his craft as he insisted that the material itself was what mattered most, trailing off as he prepared to state his conditions. But instead of stating a simple condition, Watts suddenly dropped to his knees in a deep, reverent bow, stunning Rein. Flustered by the master craftsman's intense gesture, Rein quickly told him he understood and begged him to just take the job and get up off the floor. As smoke began to billow from the workshop, Shiro waited patiently outside. Inside, Watts let out a sigh of pure relief, a wide, satisfied grin spreading across his face now that the deal was set. Rein's guardian, having arrived to formalize everything, instructed them to proceed with the contract as planned, and Rein simply accepted the massive task, telling them to leave it all to him. Having just accepted the monumental task, Rein cheerfully announced that he should be going soon, leaving his guardian completely baffled. Before the Lord could even respond, his aide exploded in protest, demanding to know what on earth his master was thinking. The blacksmith was stunned by his easy acceptance, calling him a truly reasonable person, to which the boy cheerfully replied that he could just call him Rein. But as Rein turned to leave as if the monumental task was nothing, Watts suddenly became flustered, trying to explain that his words didn't truly capture his astonishment. But Watts's astonishment quickly turned into a business proposition. With a wide grin, he presented Rein with a massive pile of raw ore, declaring that he couldn't possibly start the job until Rein purified every last chunk of iron in the workshop into that same high-quality steel. Rein could only stare back, completely dumbfounded by the blacksmith's outrageous demand. Seeing the boy's stunned silence, Watts's wide grin faltered as he could only mutter a confused awe. As the weight of the absurd demand finally sank in, a strained, hollow smile formed on Rein's face. All he ever wanted was to live a slow life, a simple dream that seemed to be slipping further and further away with every new complication. Rein sighed internally, realizing that for someone who just wanted to relax, his list of responsibilities was growing at an alarming rate. Next to him, Shuro, completely oblivious to his master's inner turmoil, simply sat down for a good scratch. With a tremendous crash, another massive section of land was cleared for the Proudlord House's ambitious development project. Standing beside his powerful father, the Baron, a young Rein saluted proudly as he watched their people working below, noting with satisfaction that the clearing was coming along very nicely. Gazing at the massive land clearing operation, Rein's father expressed his disbelief that this barren wasteland could one day become rich farmland, to which a confident young Rein simply agreed, already envisioning the prosperous future he would build. Building on his father's amazement, Rain enthusiastically laid out his brilliant agricultural plan, declaring that they could start large-scale farming that very year by rotating between rice and wheat. Before his father could even process that, Rain launched into an ambitious 3-year plan to introduce even more crops, forcing the overwhelmed Baron to ask him to slow down. But his father just laughed, teasing Rain for his strange pronunciation and correcting him that the crops were actually called Kum and Muki. Rain froze, a wave of panic washing over him as he realized he'd used words from his previous life. He quickly stammered in agreement, inwardly cursing himself for the careless slip that almost exposed his greatest secret. Quickly covering for his slip of the tongue, Rain explained to his father that rice was called Kum and wheat was Muki, noting that other vegetables like tomato also existed with slightly tweaked names, which suddenly reminded him of another important matter to discuss. That important matter was Rain's grand vision for the future, and he immediately launched into the details. He explained that to manage the farmland smoothly, they would first need to properly allocate the land and select suitable tenant farmers. He continued, outlining the need to develop new farming tools, establish trade routes with nearby nobles, and even build storage for surplus crops. To top it all off, Rain added they would also need to plan new residential areas for the anticipated population growth, admitting that there was still so much to do. Completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of his son's ambitions, Rain's father shouted that he couldn't possibly do everything at once. Rain agreed with a sinister grin, thinking to himself that his grand slow life plan was just getting started. His expression then quickly brightened as he excitedly declared that with these preparations, their territory was guaranteed to thrive more than ever before. As his dream of a simple life seemed to slip further away, Rain's mind drifted back to the past, to the very beginning of his grand ambitions for their territory. He remembered standing proudly beside his father, looking out over the vast land they had just begun to develop. The memory was clear. A younger Rain stood beside his father, looking over the vast expanse of land they had just cleared for their territory's future. As Rain spoke of his grand ambitions, his father looked on with pride, simply saying he hoped it would all come true. Their moment of shared optimism, however, was broken by the sight of a carriage kicking up dust as it sped towards them from the horizon. The carriage rattled to a stop, and inside, a man in full armor named Vincent Greatwall sneered at the view from the window, dismissing the land as the same countryside dump it had always been. As the lavish carriage pulled up to the estate, Rain and his father were informed that a tax inspector had been sent directly from the capital. Rain's father admitted he'd been expecting someone eventually, but confessed their arrival was much sooner than he had anticipated, his grim expression filling Rain with concern. Rain's father elaborated further, revealing that while Rain was preoccupied with Watts's work, he had been sending detailed progress reports to the kingdom. This was why he could foresee the inspection to some degree, and he now warned Rain of the almost certain consequence a significant tax hike was coming. True to his father's warning, a tax inspector from the capital arrived, a smug noble named Vincent Greatwall. Without preamble, he announced a staggering tax increase, leaving both Rain and his father utterly stunned by the sudden news. With a clatter of his armor, the inspector sat down, completely ignoring their stunned silence. He then smugly introduced himself as Vincent Greatwall, the tax inspector from the capital, effectively dismissing any immediate protest. Rain, however, immediately pointed out that the tax inspector was late. The man reacted with theatrical outrage, clutching his head as he announced his name was Vincent Greatwall, of the prestigious Greatwall Marquis' house. He berated them for having the guts to keep him waiting, boasting that his family had served as close aides to the royal family for generations. Inside the manor, Rain's father politely thanked Vincent for his patience, but Rain, observing from the side, immediately sensed that this man was a seriously dangerous type. As the Baron began to offer a formal welcome, Vincent arrogantly cut him off, demanding they skip the pleasantries and declaring he was there on royal orders to recalculate their new tax rates. Vincent made himself comfortable on the couch, explaining that he'd already had land maps and crop area charts prepared prior to his arrival. With a condescending tone, he then announced to a stone-faced Ryan that the calculations were already complete. With his calculations complete, Vincent wasted no time in delivering the crushing blow. He declared that the proud Lord Baron House would be expected to pay a staggering 500 gold coins starting from the next term, adding a curt "that is all" to signal the discussion was over. The number hung in the air, a staggering 500 gold coins. To put that into perspective, a single gold coin in this world is worth roughly 100,000 modern yen. Rain's face went pale as the calculation clicked in his mind. Vincent was demanding a 50 million yen tax hike on land that was still completely undeveloped. Rain's father leaped to his feet, stammering in disbelief that the new tax was 10 times higher than anything they had ever paid before. Across from him, Vincent remained perfectly calm, coldly asking if the Baron had a problem with his decision. Struggling for words, Rain's father tried to protest, but Vincent cut him off with ice-cold authority. He recited the kingdom's law, reminding them that taxes are based solely on the area a tax officer deems arable, and condescendingly told the Baron not to pretend he didn't know the rules, leaving Rain to watch in frustrated silence. Undeterred, Rain's father tried to reason with the smug inspector, explaining that the tax was based on pure projections for land that wasn't even being farmed yet. He pleaded with Vincent to at least delay the assessment until they had a real harvest to show, while Rain watched anxiously from his seat. With his father out of the way, Rain's face became a mask of cold, silent fury as he stared down at Vincent, his eyes promising retribution for the tears of his little sister. But Vincent coldly dismissed his plea, sneering that he didn't know what gave the Baron the wrong idea. This wasn't a proposal, he declared with absolute authority. It was a decision. To hammer his point home, Vincent spread his arms wide and smugly declared that his decisions were to be treated as royal orders, warning that any objection would be considered an act of treason, leaving Rain completely stunned by his tyrannical abuse of power. With the threat of treason hanging over them, Rain's father made the difficult choice to protect his family and people. He swallowed every ounce of his pride and performed a deep, humiliating bow before Vincent, who Rain recognized as a textbook power-tripping bully. Rain watched the tense standoff, wondering how his usually formidable father could possibly reason with a man who so clearly enjoyed wielding his power. Despite the humiliation and threats, his father slumped onto the sofa and continued to plead, begging Vincent to reconsider the crushing tax. Watching his father slumped in defeat, Ryan felt a surge of pride and understanding. He realized that beneath his dad's muscular exterior was a man who valued nothing more than his family and his people, willing to sacrifice anything for their sake. Rain watched his father, filled with a newfound respect for a man who could bow his head even to someone so despicable. But as a former Japanese man, Rain knew the true power behind such a gesture, and with a confident smirk, he realized it was time to show them what a real Dejeza was all about. But before Rain could act, the heavy silence was broken by a sweet voice. His little sister Elizabeth entered the room, completely unaware of the crushing tension or her father bowing on the floor. With her teddy bear Kumako-chan sitting on a tray, she beamed at the cruel inspector and offered him a cup of tea, greeting him with an innocent, childish mispronunciation of his title. A small voice cut through the tension as Ryan's younger sister formally introduced herself to the inspector as Elizabeth Proudlord. Kneeling nearby, Rain's heart ached seeing how nervous his sister was, yet she was trying her absolute best to help. With a hopeful, blushing smile, Elizabeth held out a teacup, sincerely asking Vincent if he would please have some tea. But her kind gesture was met with pure contempt as Vincent viciously swatted the teacup away, shattering it mid-air. The hot liquid flew across the room, splashing violently against Elizabeth's beloved teddy bear, Kumako-chan. Elizabeth could only let out a small, heartbroken gasp as the pieces of the teacup, lovingly prepared by her mother, fell to the floor in front of her. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face as she clutched her teddy bear, Kumako-chan, stammering that her mother had worked so hard just to prepare that tea for their guest. As Vincent stood callously over her, the heartbroken Elizabeth could only squeeze her beloved teddy bear Kumako-chan, seeking comfort from the senseless cruelty. Her silent distress meant nothing to the cruel inspector. Vincent simply took a sip of the tea, his eyes filled with scorn as he demanded to know who gave a child like her permission to speak to him. His cruelty didn't stop with words, as Vincent then callously dumped the entire teacup over Elizabeth's head. The liquid drenched both her and her beloved bear Kumako-chan, as the little girl cried out in shocked disbelief. Instead of showing a shred of remorse, Vincent erupted into mocking laughter, bringing a hand to his forehead as if he found their pathetic display of defiance and despair utterly amusing. His mocking laughter twisted into a cruel sneer as he viciously insulted the offering, declaring it a pathetic excuse for tea with no color or taste and claiming that even slum water would be an improvement. But Vincent's cruelty didn't end with the tea. He then turned his venom on Elizabeth herself, sneering that such a pathetic drink was a perfect match for her tacky little outfit. The cruel words were the final straw and Elizabeth burst into heartbreaking sobs. Seeing his little sister cry, something inside Rain finally snapped. He shoved his father aside and stepped forward, his face a mask of pure rage as Vincent roared in disbelief, questioning how a mere country noble could possibly think to defy him. Furious at the blatant defiance, Vincent snarled that Ryan should be grateful he wasn't simply taking his head off with his sword, but the threat did nothing to quell the boy's cold fury. But Vincent's threats were meaningless, as Rain's fury was solely focused on one thing: the man who had just made his precious little sister cry. With a powerful shove, Rain pushed his own father aside, clearing his path to Vincent. Shocked, the Baron could only scream his son's name, desperately ordering him to stand down as a worried Elizabeth looked on. As Rain's fury exploded, Vincent's world seemed to dissolve into a black void, the arrogant noble completely paralyzed by the sheer pressure as his mind managed only a single, stunned thought. Rain's fury finally erupted into a raw, trembling shout, his voice filled with hatred as he roared at the inspector, accusing the bastard of making his little sister cry. Rain's furious accusation echoed through the room as he placed himself directly in the path of the armored inspector. His eyes, burning with a cold rage, were locked on Vincent, the man who had dared to make his sister cry. Stunned by the boy's sheer audacity, Vincent's shock quickly turned to rage. He snarled that Rain wouldn't get away with such disrespect and, without warning, unleashed a powerful magical attack that tore across the floor, rushing straight for the defiant young boy. As Rain's furious shout echoed through the room, he pulled his little sister Ellie into a protective embrace. His rage was suddenly cut short by another voice, as his panicked mother screamed his name, desperate to stop him from defying a royal knight. His mother continued to plead with him, acknowledging his anger but desperately warning him not to injure the royal inspector. Rein's rage was momentarily stunned, his face twisting into an expression of utter disbelief at her plea. But Vincent's shock quickly boiled into pure rage, and he snarled that if Rein truly wished to die, he would gladly grant that wish. Casting aside his official roles, the inspector declared that as a royal knight, he would eliminate Rein for his defiance. Acting on his threat, Vincent channeled his magic, screaming that a blade of ice would strike Rein's throat. He declared that the fool should prepare to die, but his attack was met with an unseen defense as the magical ice blade shattered into countless shards, disintegrating before it could reach its target. Enraged that a mere boy would defy him, Vincent retaliated with magic, thrusting his hand forward and screaming Blizzard Arrow as he launched a deadly projectile of ice directly at Rein. The deadly shard of ice hurtled directly towards Rein, but the boy didn't even flinch. He stood his ground, his face a mask of pure, undiluted fury as he watched the magical attack close in. But just as the shard was about to strike, it sizzled and completely evaporated into a cloud of steam, disappearing before it could even touch him. Vincent unleashed a powerful Blizzard Arrow, but the magical projectile stopped dead in mid-air, slamming into an invisible barrier that shimmered into existence before Rein. The inspector could only stammer in disbelief, completely shocked that his attack had been so effortlessly nullified. The magical projectile, blocked by Rein's invisible shield, fell and shattered harmlessly on the floor. Stuttering in disbelief, the inspector accused him of using cheap tricks, but Rein's patience had finally snapped. His face hidden in shadow, he declared with cold fury that the man had finally made him truly angry. Unimpressed, Vincent scoffed at Rein's declaration of anger, mockingly asking what he found so funny. But in an instant, Rein's furious expression melted away, replaced by one of wide-eyed innocence. He then calmly turned the tables on the inspector, asking if Vincent wasn't the one who had been mad this entire time, all while the genuine, cold rage never left his eyes. Rein offered a disarming, almost cheerful apology, but the calm act only fueled Vincent's rage. Enraged by the mockery, the inspector's fury exploded as he raised his sword, vowing that the boy would die full of regret for his insolence. As his fury peaked, Vincent began a powerful incantation, proclaiming he would manifest a frozen hell. Drawing on his mana, he called forth ice from the edge of the polar world as the very air in the room began to crackle and freeze. With his sword held high, Vincent finished his deadly incantation, vowing that the blades of his spell would gather at his enemy's throat and tear him apart. Behind him, a massive sphere of raw, frozen magic began to crack and form, signaling the imminent unleashing of his ultimate attack. That immense magical pressure didn't go unnoticed. Elsewhere, in a quiet study, the windows suddenly began to rattle, catching the attention of a studious elf-like woman who looked up in concern, wondering about the source of the abnormal surge of mana she had just felt. But Rein's rage did nothing to intimidate the arrogant knight, who simply met the outburst with his own power. He charged forward, unleashing a powerful ice spell he called Frozen Hell Cositus. But the attack never landed. In a flash of movement and with a deafening clang of steel, Rein intercepted the knight's charge, stopping him dead in his tracks. With a contemptuous sweep of his arm, Rein effortlessly deflected the tax inspector's magical attack, a swirling vortex of energy dissipating the ice spell before it came close. He stood firm, a shield for the woman and a tearful Ellie cowering behind him. The tax inspector, Vincent, could only stammer in disbelief, his mind failing to comprehend what had just happened. His powerful ice magic had been effortlessly swept aside with a single, casual gesture from Rein. Across the room, Rein stood his ground as a calm and unwavering shield for Ellie, his simple act of defiance leaving the arrogant knight completely dumbfounded. Utterly humiliated that his magic was swatted away like a fly, the inspector gritted his teeth in a silent rage. He roared that if it had come to this, he would get serious, and then launched himself across the room in a furious charge, closing the distance to Rein in an instant. As the inspector closed the distance, he drew his massive sword, intending to end the defiant boy's life with a single, furious swing, but Rein didn't even flinch. To the inspector's utter disbelief, the young mage met the steel blade head-on, stopping the powerful downward slash with nothing more than his bare hand. As the inspector stared, his sword still caught in the boy's hand, Rein's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He snarled that for the unforgivable sin of making his little sister cry, he was going to make this bastard pay dearly. With a furious glint in his eyes, Rein swiftly caught the inspector's descending blade, stopping the attack dead in its tracks with a resounding clang. The inspector's mind reeled in pure, unadulterated terror, unable to comprehend how this mere boy could wield such overwhelming power and possess a depth of magical knowledge that completely dwarfed his own. Frozen in place, Vincent could only watch in stunned horror as his magically enchanted sword began to vibrate violently. With a deafening crack, the blade shattered into pieces, and a pathetic shriek of pure terror escaped the knight's lips. Overwhelmed by fear, Vincent's legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the nearby couch with a clatter of armor. As the defeated knight slumped down, Rain's voice cut through the silence, calmly moving on as if he hadn't just shattered the man's weapon and his will. As the terrified Vincent trembled on the couch, Rain finally delivered the chilling reason behind his ruthless display of power, declaring that this was all for the sin of making his sweet little Ellie cry. With that sin laid bare, Rain slowly rose to his feet, his voice dangerously low as he promised to make Vincent pay the price in full. Just as quickly as it appeared, Rain's explosive rage vanished, replaced by an unnervingly calm smile. As the terrified Vincent trembled before him, Rain coolly brought up the topic of tax collecting, asking with a chilling grin if that was something the inspector was actually good at. Without waiting for an answer, Ryan calmly explained a simple scientific principle, noting how Vincent's own ice magic had cooled his sword and made the metal incredibly brittle. To demonstrate the concept of heat shock, Rain then applied a rapid burst of heat, and the inspector could only stare in disbelief as his enchanted blade violently shattered into countless pieces. The inspector, now collapsed on the floor, could only sweat and comment on how sharp the glittering fragments of his sword were. But Rain wasn't finished. With a chillingly pleasant smile, he calmly suggested that if it were the inspector's arms, he could probably slice them off just as cleanly, a threat that made the terrified knight let out a pathetic squeak. Rain then turned his attention from the knight's arms to a far more critical area, coolly pointing out how mages use their throat to chant spells. As the words left his mouth, the inspector's armored gorget began to violently freeze and crack, the metal groaning as it shattered just like his sword had moments before. With the inspector's armor shattered and his vulnerability exposed, Rain leaned in with a terrifyingly calm smile, softly asking if the knight preferred his throat over his arms. The question completely broke the inspector's mind. Stuttering in pure terror, Vincent could only ask what Rain was talking about, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. Rain calmly continued his lesson, bringing up the topic of ice magic while revealing he was now holding Vincent's very own sword. As he spoke, the inspector's hand shot to his hip, closing on nothing but empty air as he realized with dawning horror that his weapon was gone. Rain casually examined Vincent's enchanted sword, feigning a bit of difficulty as he noted its surprising weight. With the stunned inspector watching in disbelief, Rain then asked if he could pose a rather unusual question, his calm demeanor only amplifying the knight's growing terror. With the inspector's enchanted blade still in hand, Rain continued his lesson with a cheerful smile, asking the terrified knight what happens to metal that's been cooled to its absolute limit. But as he finished the question, his smile vanished and his gaze turned as cold and sharp as ice, revealing his true intent. Rain then began to lecture the knight on a simple principle known as heat shock, explaining that while things normally expand with heat and shrink with cold, a rapid and extreme temperature change would fatally deform even the strongest metal, regardless of how unchanged it appeared on the surface. Rain then applied his lesson to a chillingly practical example, asking what would happen if the object in question were a sword. As Vincent looked on with dawning horror, Rain explained the method: slightly heat the metal to make it expand, then rapidly cool it far beyond its limit, pushing the object until it simply can't take the strain anymore. With a deafening crack, Vincent's prized magical sword, made brittle by the extreme temperature change, shattered into 1,000 pieces before his very eyes. The inspector stared in horrified disbelief as Rain calmly held up the broken hilt, coolly stating that this is what happens. Presenting the broken hilt with a smooth motion, Rain made sure the inspector got a good look at his ruined weapon. The knight, who had fallen backward in his chair, could only stare up from the floor in utter disbelief at his complete and total defeat. Looming over the terrified inspector, he effortlessly shattered another piece of the man's frozen armor with his bare fist, making his point crystal clear. With a chilling smile, Rain then leaned in and asked if the knight wanted to test that same shattering effect on his own body next. The terrifying threat was more than the inspector could handle, and he immediately collapsed to the ground, utterly defeated by fear. As he fell, the adult woman sternly called Ryan's name, disapproving of his extreme methods, while a shocked Ellie looked on and Rain simply offered a cold, satisfied smile. Foaming at the mouth, the inspector lay completely broken on the floor as the adult woman scolded Rain, acknowledging his anger but insisting that this was taking things too far. Rain's only response was a soft, cold laugh, completely unconcerned by her reprimand. As Rain stood over the broken inspector, his father and little sister Ellie appeared in the doorway, their eyes falling upon the shocking scene. There on the floor lay the defeated royal knight, Vincent, while their own young son stood over him, the victor of a battle that should have been impossible. This entire shocking confrontation had unfolded within the walls of the Proudlord family's stately manor, a grand home for a supposedly minor country noble. With the arrogant tax inspector dealt with, life at the Proudlord estate returned to its usual peaceful rhythm, and the family was finally able to enjoy the tranquility of their home nestled deep within the verdant forest. It was a unique and peaceful place, with whimsical treehouses built right into the massive trunks surrounding the main house, a true sanctuary hidden from the world. Sometime later, the arrogant tax inspector, Vincent Greatwall, woke with a sharp gasp, his eyes flying open in panic as the memory of his terrifying defeat came flooding back. The initial panic gave way to sheer confusion as Vincent sat bolt upright, finding himself not on a cold stone floor, but tucked into a comfortable bed. He looked around the unfamiliar sunlit room, trying to piece together what had happened after his humiliating defeat. As he took in his new surroundings, his eyes widened in shock when he realized who was in the room with him. It was the head of the Proudlord family, his wife, and their son, Rainford, the very boy who had so utterly defeated him. His gaze then settled on the final person in the room, a young girl with a worried expression who he correctly assumed was Rainford's younger sister Ellie. Vincent Greatwall eventually awoke in a comfortable, unfamiliar bed, his first thought a wave of sheer relief that he had somehow managed to avoid being killed. As his senses returned, he saw his terrifying young victor, Rainford, watching him quietly from the doorway alongside his mother. The knight was soon tended to, not as an enemy, but as an honored guest. As he sat recovering on a plush sofa, Vincent realized with a sense of bewilderment that the Proudlord family was completely ignoring his prior aggression, treating the entire conflict as if it had never occurred at all. As he tried to make sense of their baffling kindness, Vincent recalled the official story he'd been given. He had simply collapsed from overwork during the tax meeting. At least that was the official story he was given. But as Vincent sat there, he knew that collapsing from simple overwork wasn't what had truly happened. The true reason for his collapse was an experience so intense, so overwhelming, that he was certain he would never be able to forget it for the rest of his life. His mind was cast back to a similar moment of desperation from his past life. In that instant, as he reached forward, he had been utterly prepared to die. Reflecting on his utter defeat, Vincent came to a terrifying realization. Rainford could have killed him without a second thought, even if it meant war with the Marquis family, forcing Vincent to wonder if anyone could truly stand against such power. When Vincent finally regained consciousness in a strange bed, the chilling memory of his defeat was the first thing to greet him, a stark reminder of just how terrifying Rainford's power truly was. Vincent came to a humbling conclusion: to a man like Rainford, his own well-honed magic and swordsmanship must have been nothing more than child's play. The weight of his humiliation was crushing, and as Vincent's fist clenched, he was forced to admit the undeniable truth: he had been utterly and completely defeated by the boy he had so foolishly underestimated. His defeat was absolute, a crushing end to his pride, and yet what followed was not the punishment he expected. As he recovered, Vincent was treated not as a prisoner, but as an honored guest. He was served delicious, wholesome meals, but what truly captivated him were the incredibly sweet tomatoes, a special crop grown using Rainford's unique water magic. But it wasn't just the incredible food that surprised Vincent. Despite his initial hostility and the humiliating defeat he suffered, he realized the entire Proudlord family was treating him with genuine and unexpected kindness. This simple act of sharing a meal together made Vincent reflect on his own upbringing, realizing that back in his family's Grand Marquis household, a warm moment like this was completely unimaginable. The warmth of the family was one thing, but Vincent was completely taken aback by the food itself. He let out a murmur of pure delight, realizing that everything they served was delicious, with one ingredient standing out in particular. He couldn't contain his shock, exclaiming how impossibly sweet the tomato was. Watching the knight's bewildered reaction, Rainford's father simply smiled and playfully wondered what the reason could possibly be. The knight's mind reeled from the taste as a profound realization hit him. It wasn't an exaggeration, all the vegetables in this region were exceptionally flavorful, but the tomato he had just eaten was on another level entirely, something truly special. The knight soon discovered that this incredible flavor was yet another product of Rainford's magic, as the young lord proudly explained that he had grown the tomato himself using a special water magic technique. But it wasn't just his agricultural magic that astonished Vincent. He was continually surprised by the young lord's profound knowledge of complex subjects, especially taxation. Rainford calmly proposed a progressive tax system based on cultivated land size instead of a flat rate, and even suggested bold policies tailored to specific luxury goods. Listening to these sophisticated ideas, Vincent could only stare in complete shock, wondering just who this extraordinary boy truly was. As Rainford calmly continued, with his father standing silently beside him, a single thought crystallized in Vincent's mind: there was simply no way this person was just a 10-year-old child. Just as Vincent reeled from the boy's incredible knowledge, Rainford announced he had one more thing, presenting him with an exquisitely crafted sword as a replacement. As he accepted the new blade, Vincent wryly recalled the official story for his original sword, which had apparently just gone missing, sometime after he lost consciousness. To cover for his missing weapon, the Proudlord family had a brand new sword forged by the local blacksmith, Watts, who then presented the replacement blade directly to Vincent. The weapon presented to Vincent was no ordinary blade, it was a sword forged from unbelievably pure steel, a material of legendary quality. But the legendary steel was only part of the marvel, as Rainford explained that the sword's true power actually came from its unique magical properties. Putting its magical properties to the test, Vincent channeled a light ice spell into the blade, but the effect was catastrophic, instantly creating a massive, jagged mountain of ice. Horrified by its overwhelming power, Vincent realized he could never use such a conspicuous weapon in public, though he couldn't bring himself to tell Rainford that his gift was simply too strong. The discussion about the territory's future with Rainford and his father consumed the entire day. After much deliberation, they collectively decided to put the matter of the tax rate on hold for the time being. The main reason for this conclusion was that the territory's farmland was still incomplete, making a flat tax based on land area inappropriate at this stage. Later that evening, an exhausted Vincent sat in his bed, looking out the window and reflecting on how much had happened that day. As he rested, a pleasant floral scent filled the room, soothing his weary mind. With a sense of finality, Vincent resolved that tomorrow, he would finally leave the Proudlord territory. But as he settled on his decision to leave, his peace was shattered by a single, lingering regret that made his face flush with shame. He realized he still hadn't apologized to Ellie for his despicable actions. With his apologies finally given and his knightly resolve renewed, Vincent's carriage departed from the Proudlord territory as several months of tireless work and progress passed in the wasteland. As Vincent prepared to depart, he shared a final farewell with Rainford and Ellie. His carriage was loaded with provisions for the journey, including several large crates filled to the brim with the family's exceptionally delicious. Magically, as Vincent turned to depart, a voice called his name, causing him to pause and look back one last time. The voice that called out belonged to Ellie, who had rushed up to his side, offering him a small, delicate flower as a parting gift. Looking up at him with a gentle blush, Ellie sincerely wished him a safe journey home. As he prepared to depart, Ellie suddenly stepped forward, holding out a single white flower for him to take. Vincent looked down at the gift, his eyes widening in stunned recognition as he realized what kind of flower it was. He was completely floored by the gesture, realizing that even after the terrible way he had acted, Lady Ellie was still showing him genuine kindness. He was truly moved, thinking to himself that Ellie possessed a heart so gentle, she was almost like a saint. Vincent then recalled that during his recovery, Ellie had quietly placed a beautiful flower by his bedside, and he remembered how its lovely scent had allowed him to sleep peacefully. Struck by this memory of her simple kindness, Vincent quickly turned around, realizing he couldn't leave just yet. He approached Ellie and immediately knelt before her in his heavy armor. Looking up at the young girl, Vincent offered a heartfelt apology for his terrible behavior when he first arrived. Looking up at her with sincere gratitude, Vincent thanked Lady Ellie for her kindness. Visibly touched by his heartfelt apology, the young girl could only blush and cover her mouth in surprise. As he sat in quiet contemplation, the weight of his recent experiences settled upon him. He was forced to realize just how ignorant he had been of the world, and with newfound resolve, Vincent decided to consider his old, arrogant self dead and start over completely from scratch. This newfound resolve was rooted in a profound realization, a truth he later recorded in his diary. He finally recognized how foolish he had been to forget the most important duty of a knight: to serve the kingdom, and to serve its people. With Vincent having departed, several months passed peacefully in the Proudlord territory. Rainford, accompanied by his loyal Fenrir Shiro, happily celebrated another normal day, a testament to the tranquility he had worked so hard to maintain. The fruits of his labor had finally gained royal recognition, as Rainford reflected that his father was currently away, having been personally invited by the king. This great honor served as a reward for at last succeeding in the long-standing challenge of developing their territory's wasteland. After waking up in the Proudlord home, Sir Vincent was utterly terrified, convinced that at any moment his hosts would kill him. However, once he realized the family truly meant him no harm, the tension finally broke, allowing them to have a proper conversation. Rainford recalls how he and Vincent had lengthy discussions about the tax system, with the knight even conducting his own on-site inspections. They eventually agreed to postpone the decision on the tax rate, given that the farming was still experimental, though Vincent made it clear he still required regular reports. Rainford read a report from the knight, learning that Vincent intended to return for another inspection soon to check on their cultivation. Amused, Rainford noted that more than anything, it seemed the knight was completely hooked on their tomatoes, overlooking all the other vegetables they grew. As for the sword Vincent had somehow lost, Rainford explained that they sent him a replacement. He recalled how Vincent accepted the new blade with a strangely serious expression, a reaction Rainford still couldn't understand. After all, the weapon was just a fun side project he and the blacksmith Watts had cooked up, based on the silly idea that a sword that could shoot magic would be awesome. Looking back on the chaotic encounter with the inspector, Rainford reflected that despite everything that happened, he was glad they met him. After all, the man had changed enough that in the end, he even properly apologized to a blushing Ellie for his past cruelty. However, Rainford's thoughts took a dark turn, his expression hardening as he admitted to himself that he still hadn't forgiven Vincent for flirting with his sister. But just as quickly, he pushed the possessive thought from his mind, deciding to put the matter aside. Months passed and Rainford focused on his duties, turning down an invitation to the royal capital by admitting formal events just weren't his thing. He much preferred riding Shiro through the forest, gleefully telling his companion how convenient it was to have noble excuses like inspecting the wasteland to avoid such stuffy occasions. As their patrol continued through the dense woods, Rainford looked towards the horizon and remarked to Shiro that the sun was already starting to set, bringing their day's inspection to a close. But as Rainford suggested they head home, he was cut off mid-sentence, jolted by a sudden noise from the woods. Before he could even react, Shiro launched forward with explosive speed, carrying a startled Rainford on his back as they blazed through the trees toward the disturbance. Barely hanging on, Rainford shouted for his companion to wait, but Shiro completely ignored him, continuing the high-speed charge deeper into the woods. As Shiro continued his reckless charge through the forest, Rainford's eyes suddenly locked onto a shocking scene in a clearing just ahead. He realized with a start that it was an elf, clutching an injured arm as she was completely surrounded by a pack of menacing wolves closing in for the kill. The young elf was clearly injured, clutching a deep gash on her arm as she grimaced in pain, but her eyes held a defiant spark against the wolves that had her cornered. Suddenly, Rainford stumbled upon the scene, his eyes widening in pure disbelief at the sight of the brutal attack. The injured elf clutched her bruised arm in pain, her desperate situation stunning Rainford as he arrived on Shiro's back. As his loyal Fenrir bared its teeth at the aggressive wolf, Rainford quickly urged him forward, knowing he had to get closer to cast a spell and end the fight. Without a moment's hesitation, Shiro launched himself forward like a bolt of white lightning, his roar echoing through the trees. He slammed into the attacking wolf with overwhelming force, sending the beast flying before it could even react to the sudden, brutal assault. The wolf's body was sent flying through the air, its journey ending abruptly as it smashed into a thick tree with a sickening, bone-shattering crack. The remaining wolves growled in shocked confusion at the sudden, brutal display. But their surprise was cut short as the rest of the pack was instantly knocked unconscious, thudding to the ground around the now safe elf. Watching the swift and brutal efficiency of the takedown, Rainford could only offer a slightly awkward, satisfied smile. His satisfaction quickly turned into pure exhilaration as he enthusiastically praised his companion, exclaiming that Shiro had done an amazing job. Unable to resist, Rainford then buried his face in Shiro's incredibly soft fur, completely overjoyed by his partner's strength and fluffiness. After his moment of celebration with Shiro, Rainford turned his attention back to the elf they had just rescued. With the wolves gone, an awkward silence fell over the clearing. Unsure of what to say to the mysterious, wounded stranger, Rainford could only stammer nervously, his hand resting on Shiro for reassurance. He cautiously reached out, asking if she was okay, but his kindness was met with hostility. The injured elf fiercely warned him to stay back, spitting the word human like an insult. The injured elf's gaze was filled with pure contempt, her eyes burning with a deep-seated hatred for his kind. Rainford was left speechless, completely stunned by the venom directed at him for simply being human. But as her hateful glare shifted, she finally noticed the massive white beast at Rainford's side. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her contempt momentarily forgotten as she demanded to know why a mere human like him was traveling with a Fenrir. Faced with the elf's hostile demand, Rainford simply offered a gentle smile as Shiro, the massive Fenrir, tilted his head and let out a curious woof, completely unbothered by her aggression. Rainford processed the elf's hostile question, his mind flashing back to something he'd read. He recalled hearing that in this world, the legendary creature known as Fenrir truly existed. His memory flashed back to a day in the library, where he recalled reading about a great wolf just like the one beside him. Rainford concluded that with such a legendary name, his companion must be a very intelligent creature. Rainford proudly concluded that with such a legendary name, his companion must be an incredibly intelligent creature, but Shiro could only offer a completely blank and dumbfounded stare in response. Shiro's blank stare quickly hardened into a tense, almost annoyed expression, leaving Rainford completely speechless as an awkward silence stretched between them. Rainford's attention shifted from her hostility to her injuries, and he cautiously asked if one of the wolves had bitten her head. His concern was met with pure rage, as the elf furiously demanded he stop looking at her with such pitiful eyes. Ignoring her fury, Rainford's eyes dropped, and he finally saw the true extent of her injuries. A deep, severe-looking wound was torn across her thigh, the real source of her agony. He tried to express his concern, pointing out that her injury looked pretty bad, but his words were cut short. The elf snapped back with pure hostility, furiously telling him to shut up and calling him a human. The elf's paranoia escalated as she accused Rainford of faking the rescue just to lure her away for some terrible purpose, angrily demanding to know if he was even listening. But Rainford completely misread her terror, internally musing that this must be a bizarre attempt to get close enough to seduce Fenrir, and simply replied with a nonchalant, "Is that so?" Ignoring her aggressive tone, Rainford simply raised his hand as a warm, gentle light gathered in his palm. The light then streamed forward, instantly enveloping the injured elf. She could only stare in utter disbelief, completely stunned as the magic healed her without a single word. As the healing light faded, Rainford calmly explained that he had treated her injury, but cautioned her to rest quietly since the bleeding hadn't completely stopped. With his task complete, Rainford nonchalantly told her to let the wound heal as he hopped onto Shiro's back preparing to leave. The elf could only stare in stunned silence, utterly bewildered that he had cast such a powerful healing spell without uttering a single word of incantation. Noticing her stunned silence, Rainford calmly reassured the elf that he had no intention of harming her and announced that he would be leaving immediately. As Rainford prepared to depart, the elf girl could only stammer, her mind reeling from his unexpected kindness. Her face then froze in utter disbelief as the reality of the situation sunk in. This human had healed her without an incantation and was now leaving without demanding anything in return. Just as Rainford and Shiro began to walk away, the elf girl's voice cut through the silence, desperately calling out for him to wait. Hearing her call, Rainford halted their departure, looking back from atop Shiro as the massive Fenrir waited patiently for her to speak. Looking up at him with a flustered yet determined expression, the elf finally spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet forest as she pleaded for him to wait. She began with a sincere apology, admitting that she had acted disrespectfully toward the very person who had just saved her. She then explained that while investigating the forest, her group was attacked by a wolf, and while her companions managed to escape, she wasn't quick enough to get away. Rainford sincerely swore to the forest god and the wind spirit to express his thanks. The elf simply replied that it was fine, but Rainford couldn't help but ask why she had been so wary of him at first. As they began walking together, she explained that as a young human, he likely didn't yet know the history that fueled her caution. The elf then recounted a dark chapter in history, revealing that humans had once captured and enslaved her people. She explained how they were exploited and relentlessly forced into war as mere tools of battle. The memory of what the elven women and children had to endure, she admitted, still filled her with profound regret and rage. The elf explained that she was taught from childhood that humans were a savage race who committed unspeakable atrocities, a belief she had always accepted without question. But as Rainford listened, she admitted that today, his actions had shown her that there are exceptions. As they walked on together, the elf quietly offered Rainford her heartfelt thanks. She then stopped abruptly, turning to face him as she realized that in her haste and hostility, she had completely forgotten to introduce herself. Realizing her oversight, the elf smiles warmly and introduces herself as Rhea, explaining that she lives in this forest. Rainford smiles back, introducing himself as Rainford Prodlord, the eldest son of the Baron's family, and clarifying that the kingdom has entrusted him with managing the very forest they stand in. As they continued to walk, Rainford suddenly stopped, a confused expression on his face. He pointed out that they seemed to be heading in the complete opposite direction of the forest entrance. A quick mental map confirmed his suspicion. They were venturing deeper into the woods, not towards his home, and he knew he really needed to be getting back. Finally confirming they were heading away from the exit, Rainford cautiously asked where she was taking him. Rhea simply stated they were going to her village, an answer that caught him completely by surprise and left him thoroughly confused. Rainford immediately tried to decline, planting his feet against a nearby tree, but Rhea simply laughed and began to drag him along anyway. He pleaded that his mother was extremely strict about his curfew and he'd be in serious trouble, but she just waved off his concerns with a cheerful smile, confidently telling him he would thank her later. Desperately trying to reason with her, Rainford proposed a compromise, asking if he could just go home for now and visit her village tomorrow instead. Rhea paused for a moment as if considering his plea, but her solution was far more direct, and she casually tossed him through the air, sending him hurtling helplessly towards a massive tree. As she sent him flying, Rhea nonchalantly told him to drop the formalities and just call her by her name. Stunned and airborne, Rainford could only scream in his mind that her timing for such a casual remark was completely insane, given that she was literally throwing him through the forest. His shock quickly turned to panic as he hurtled through the forest, a massive tree trunk suddenly looming directly in his path. With no way to stop himself, Rainford could only scream in terror, realizing he was about to collide head-on. But instead of a bone-shattering crash, Rainford passed directly through the tree as if it were made of water. He realized in an instant that he had just gone through a powerful, vision-deceiving barrier. As he emerged on the other side, Rainford's eyes widened in disbelief, his mind instantly identifying the sophisticated spell he had just passed through as a powerful barrier magic designed to deceive vision. Rainford tumbled through the barrier, landing roughly on the ground on the other side. As he pushed himself up and got his bearings, his eyes widened in awe at the sight of a beautiful, hidden settlement nestled among the trees, and he immediately recognized it as the fabled elf village. His moment of awe was shattered as hostile elf villagers spotted him, immediately pinning him to the ground with their spears. They demanded to know why a human was in their village, shouting for reinforcements and proclaiming their hatred for his kind. As Rhea desperately tried to intervene, Rainford remained surprisingly calm, mentally agreeing with their prejudice. Rhea then shouted over the commotion, pleading with her people and declaring that this boy was the one who had saved her. However, Ria's desperate pleas fell on deaf ears as the elf villagers, consumed by their distrust of humans, refused to stand down. From their positions in the trees, they knocked their bows and unleashed a deadly volley of arrows directly at Reinford. The shafts rained down, striking the ground all around him, but the boy remained perfectly still, not showing a single hint of fear. But before the arrows could reach him, they froze in mid-air, repelled by an invisible force. A deep, menacing growl suddenly echoed through the village as the massive form of Fenrir materialized, standing guard over the still-seated Rainford and paralyzing the elves with shock. But the attack was already underway, and arrows sliced through the air, heading straight for Rainford. In the next instant, a second volley of blunt, tipped projectiles intercepted them with pinpoint accuracy, knocking the lethal shafts harmlessly aside. The elf villagers could only stare in disbelief as their assault was effortlessly neutralized, with the intercepting arrows embedding themselves in the trees. As the elves reeled from the sudden appearance of the massive creature, one of them identified the divine beast as Fenrir. Before they could react, Rhea leaped between them and Rain, shouting for everyone to stand down. She quickly explained that this was the very beast that had saved her life when she was attacked by a forest wolf and nearly drowned. Despite her impassioned defense, the other elves remained deeply suspicious, unable to believe a human would help one of their own. They began to wonder aloud if Rhea had been brainwashed by the boy, prompting a frustrated Rhea to demand why they refused to believe her. Before Rhea's desperate defense could continue, the tense standoff was broken by a small voice crying out her name. A young elf girl named Lulu rushed forward, throwing her arms around Rhea in a tight hug while another villager looked on with profound relief, glad that she had returned safely. Their accusations were suddenly cut short by a new, commanding voice telling them to settle down. A tall, elegant elf woman, Reinford Proud Lord, stepped forward, her authoritative presence silencing the commotion. As Rhea looked on in surprise, the chief fixed the aggressive elves with a stern glare, demanding to know how they could treat the person who saved her granddaughter with such blatant hostility. The chief's authoritative rebuke immediately brought the villagers to heel, forcing them to kneel in submission. Having dealt with her people, Reinford Proud Lord turned directly to Rainford and offered a deep, formal apology for their inexcusable hostility. As Rainford got his first proper look at the village chief, he was stunned into silence. He couldn't help but notice that Rainford Proud Lord looked just like an older, more composed version of Rhea, who stood beside her with a worried expression. Accepting her offer, Rainford followed the village chief, Rainford, into her home, where a cup was set firmly on the table before him. Inside the chief's home, Rainford gave a stiff, formal bow as he sat at the table across from Rainford. Another elf politely served them while Rhea stood nearby, the tense air of the village still lingering despite the formal apology. Even as he accepted the chief's hospitality, Rainford's mind raced, wondering how he'd just gone with the flow and ended up here, and what excuse he could possibly make when he got home. He cautiously took a sip of the tea, half expecting the worst, only to be completely shocked by how delicious it was. The tea was incredible, with a refreshing aroma and a subtle sweetness that left a clean aftertaste. It was so good that he immediately felt it was the perfect remedy for a tired mind and desperately wanted to have some for himself. As Rainford savored the incredible flavor, Rainford smiled warmly from across the table. She noted how heartily he was drinking and said she was glad he seemed to like it. A cautious voice in the back of Rainford's mind questioned the situation, wondering if the tea might be poisoned given the elves' earlier hostility. But the drink's incredible flavor and aroma quickly overshadowed his suspicion. As he enjoyed the tea, the village chief asked Rainford if he had been afraid on his way to her home, pointing out the villagers' clear hatred for humans. She wondered if he ever thought he'd be harmed, but Rainford simply smiled. He explained that because he had become friends with Rhea, he could never bring himself to doubt an offering from the people of his friend's village. Her words hung in the air, met only by the sound of an elf swallowing hard in the stunned silence, his disbelief finally giving way to fear. But in a bizarre twist, Rhea erupted into laughter at Rainford's completely unfazed reaction to the news of a legendary dragon. With a straight face, Rainford simply agreed that her amused observation was, in fact, true. As an image of his past self, Shoichiro, appeared behind him, Rainford continued his calm assessment, musing that even if people were aware of the dragon, he wondered how many could actually do anything about it. Observing his incredible composure, Rainford Proud Lord remarked that he was far too mature for a human child, a comment that caught Rainford so off guard he spat out his tea. Beside them, a blushing Rhea playfully begged her grandmother to stop the teasing. Ignoring Rhea's playful pleas to stop, Rainford Proud Lord's attention shifted directly to her granddaughter, coolly remarking how unusual it was for her to bring a human into their village. The sudden change of subject left Rhea stammering in shock, calling out her grandmother's name in disbelief. Shifting her focus from her flustered granddaughter, the village chief turned her serene yet firm gaze to the boy, formally addressing him as Rainford Proud Lord. She offered her sincere thanks for saving Rhea's life and announced that as the village's leader, she would now properly express their gratitude. As Rainford Proud Lord expressed her profound gratitude, Rainford felt the weight of the moment and awkwardly deflected the praise. He quickly clarified that he hadn't done anything special, insisting it was his companion Shiro, who had actually saved Rhea from the wolf pack. Rainford proud, Lord listened with a knowing smile, telling Rainford there was no need to be so humble. Believing their meeting was fated, she invited him to stay and talk for a bit. Rainford proud, Lord's expression turned grave as she began to explain the forest's recent troubles. The wolves that attacked Rhea, she said, don't normally venture so close to the village. In fact, the population of all magic beasts had been rapidly increasing, and she feared it was because an even stronger, more ancient creature had awakened deep within the woods. Rainford repeated the chief's words, questioning if a strong magic beast was truly the cause of the disturbance. Rainford proud Lord confirmed his fears, gravely explaining that the creature she spoke of was an ancient dragon that had awakened deep within the forest. As Rainford spoke the words, the terrifying reality of the situation became clear. Deep within the forest, an ancient dragon had indeed awakened, its colossal, shadowy form stirring with a power that now threatened to unravel the balance of the entire region. The weight of her words settled heavily on Rainford as he stammered in disbelief. An ancient dragon. With a somber and unwavering gaze, Rainford proud, Lord confirmed his worst fears, affirming that it was indeed true. The weight of Rainford's revelation settled over the room, making the atmosphere feel incredibly heavy. As Rainford tried to process the world-ending news, an unseen listener hiding nearby wondered why the conversation was so suffocating, even from a distance. The intense formality of the situation made Rainford feel deeply uncomfortable, reminding him of his past life as a salaryman having to apologize to business clients. Trying to break the tension, he offered an awkward smile and complimented the elven chief, remarking that Rainford proud, Lord was a rather grand and cool-sounding name. Rainford proud, Lord offered a knowing smile in response to his compliment, but her eyes held a deeper, more serious expression. She cryptically replied that if only cool was the only thing there was to her name, hinting at a much heavier burden. Trying to grasp the full implications of an awakened ancient dragon, Rainford focused on the chief's exact words, asking if her statement implied that these creatures were normally dormant. With a grave expression, Rainford proud, Lord confirmed his suspicions. As Rhea and another elf listened with concern, the chief paused for a moment before beginning her tale, stating that it came from the legends passed down by their ancestors. Rainford proud, Lord began to recount the legend, explaining that the ancient dragon had fallen into a deep slumber in the heart of the forest 2,000 years ago, a revelation that left Rainford staggering back in shock. The shocking revelation made Rainford realize why his father's library had no record of such a creature. Rainford proud, Lord continued explaining the legend, stating the dragon was prophesied to awaken after 3,000 years of slumber and plunge the world into an unprecedented crisis, but she calmly added that there was even more to the story. As the weight of Rainford proud, Lord's dire theory settled, a fierce storm raged outside the village gates, the wind howling through the forest as heavy rain poured down. As Rainford concluded her terrifying theory, the sheer weight of the crisis seemed to crush Rainford and Rhea, the Orc King, the Berserk Beasts, the Fenrir attack. It was all connected to a single, apocalyptic threat. Rainford could barely process the words, muttering a world-ending crisis in dazed confusion. The sheer scale of the revelation left him reeling, completely unable to wrap his mind around the apocalyptic future Rainford had just laid out. As the numbers from the ancient legend clicked into place, Rainford's dazed confusion suddenly sharpened into focus, and he pointed out a critical flaw in the timeline, asking if the dragon hadn't just woken up 1,000 years ahead of schedule. Just as Rainford questioned the timeline, Rainford hesitated, her expression clouding over as she conceded her entire account was based on the assumption that the legend itself was accurate. This sudden doubt plunged the room into a heavy silence, and Rainford couldn't help but feel a growing sense of dread as the mood became even more ominous. Breaking the heavy silence, Rainford proud, Lord confessed that when it came down to it, even the elves didn't really know the truth. As this admission added to Rainford's growing dread, Shiro remained blissfully unaware of the danger, letting out a contented sigh. Elaborating on her startling admission, Rainford proud, Lord explained that unlike humans, the long-lived elves don't keep written records, passing down their entire history verbally from one generation to the next. This, she confessed, was why they couldn't be absolutely certain about the ancient legends. Rainford, however, remained skeptical, arguing that even with an oral tradition, a 1,000-year discrepancy felt far too significant to be a simple mistake. Rainford proud, Lord then turned the question directly to Rainford, asking for his theory on why the 1,000-year gap had occurred. Caught off guard, he fell into deep thought, pondering what could have possibly caused such a massive discrepancy in the ancient legend. As Rainford struggled for an explanation, Rainford proud, Lord voiced the terrifying question hanging over them all, wondering aloud why a world-destroying dragon would awaken 1,000 years too soon. The gravity of her words sent a chill through the room, as both Raya and the other elf girl looked on with tense, worried expressions. Rainford tried to reason through the possibilities, theorizing that perhaps someone had stolen the gem sealing the dragon, or maybe a hidden crystal had been broken. He then floated a final, more delicate possibility, wondering aloud if one of the elves themselves might have simply messed up. Rainford proud, Lord confidently refuted his suggestion. She explained that elves would never make such a mistake, adding that in any case, no one currently living in the village had the power to tamper with the ancient seal. To illustrate the escalating dangers, Reinford shared a recent and alarming event, revealing that a powerful orc king had been spotted just outside their village. As she spoke, Rainford's eyes widened in recognition of the hulking beast she was describing. Reinford confirmed his silent fears, explaining that this wasn't just any orc, but a dangerous mutant type known as a walking disaster. Reinford confessed that the elves stood no chance against such a formidable foe on their own. As she spoke, she revealed their only defense, explaining that they had been forced to erect a massive, swirling barrier just to keep the walking disaster away from the village. Reinford proud, Lord then recounted a recent tragedy to emphasize the growing danger, focusing on the young girl Lulu. She explained that Lulu's father was gravely wounded by a berserk beast while investigating just outside the village barrier. Distraught and desperate to help, Lulu ventured into the woods alone to find herbs, only to be attacked by fearsome Fenrir herself. After recounting the recent string of disasters, Reinford proud, Lord prepared to offer her own explanation for the chaos. She raised a single finger, cautioning the others that what she was about to say was purely her own theory. Reinford finally revealed her own theory, explaining her belief that the dragon was not awakened by chance, but was instead roused from its slumber in response to some other, enormous and unidentified force. As Reinford proud, Lord's unsettling theory settled in the room, Reinford could only murmur that he understood. His mind raced, connecting the dots and realizing that even a monster like the Orc King couldn't possibly be the sole cause of such a catastrophe. But before he could voice his thoughts, one of the elf girls cut in, bluntly telling him that wasn't it at all, leaving Reinford confused as to why both elves were now staring at him with such intense focus. As Reinford proud Lord's theory echoed in the room, the truth began to dawn on Reinford. He finally understood that the dragon wasn't awakened by chance, but was responding to a strong power, and the terrifying implications of that fact started to click into place. With a calm smile that defied the gravity of the situation, Reinford acknowledged their hesitation, guessing that whatever they were about to say was difficult to bring up with him. The elven elder looked away, flustered that Reinford had already pieced it together and exclaiming that he'd noticed. With a knowing sigh, Reinford admitted that he had, explaining that they had given him plenty of hints to connect the dots. Hoping to find a solution, Reinford asked if elven legends mentioned any effective countermeasures against dragons. The elder's response, however, was grim, as she regretfully admitted that their history contained no specific weaknesses or strategies to combat such a creature. Struggling to grasp the situation, Reinford asked the most pressing question: was there any chance they could win in a direct fight? Reinford proud, Lord's response was a silent but resounding no. With a defeated shrug, she made it clear that challenging the ancient dragon was utterly impossible. Reinford proud, Lord elaborated on this grim reality, confessing that in her long life, she had never heard of anyone who could even fight a dragon, let alone defeat one. She described the beast's absolute power. Its entire body was covered in scales that no blade could pierce, its jaws could crush the very earth, and its fiery breath would incinerate anything it touched, leaving only ash. Faced with the reality of an unbeatable foe, Reinford pondered the situation for a moment before a brilliant idea struck him. While the elf girl looked on hopefully, he confidently suggested a radical approach, proposing they attempt a direct conversation with the dragon. The elves latched onto his idea with terrifying intensity, confirming that the parties involved needed to talk. But as they both turned to him with intense expectation, Reinford's confidence vanished, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Flustered by their unwavering expectation, Reinford panicked and tried to pass the dangerous task onto his companion. He thrust Shiro forward, insisting that the fluffy wolf should be the one to talk things out with the ancient dragon. His attempt to volunteer Shiro was met with immediate and unified horror. With identical expressions of disbelief, both the elf-like woman and the elf girl vehemently rejected the idea, screaming that he was the one who had to do it. Completely blindsided by their unified demand, all Reinford could manage was a confused squeak as a heavy silence fell over the room, punctuated only by the exasperated, synchronized sighs of the two elves. Finding his voice, Reinford nervously asked if they really wanted him to be the one to talk to the dragon. The elf girl immediately shot back that there was no one else who could do it, a declaration the elf-like woman sternly agreed with. Faced with their unshakable resolve, Reinford was left completely stunned and at a loss for words. Recovering from his shock, Reinford frantically rejected their proposal, insisting that he was just an ordinary, cute 10-year-old kid and completely unqualified to negotiate with a mythical beast. Ignoring his frantic protests, the elf-like woman's expression turned grim as she began to explain that recent investigations had uncovered some troubling new information. She began to explain, revealing that their investigation had found huge ponds and strange, massive craters suddenly appearing deep within the forest. As she spoke, a look of dawning horror spread across Reinford's face, the terrible implications of her words becoming painfully clear. The elf-like woman continued, adding that their investigation had also uncovered unnaturally hard earthen walls. She then delivered the final piece of damning evidence. revealing that she had recently detected a massive surge of magical energy from outside the forest, forcing Rainford to realize with dawning horror that she was describing his own actions. Rainford proud, Lord then declared that her theory was now essentially a confirmed fact. She explained that the sleeping dragon was lured and awakened by an immense and abnormal surge of magic that had suddenly appeared in the world, a power so great it woke the beast all at once. The elf-like woman stared down at Rainford, asking if he had anything to say in his defense for causing the surge of magic. With a strange smile, he meekly replied he had nothing to add and slumped onto the table in defeat, wondering if he would really have to fight. Then, in a desperate attempt to change the subject, he suddenly perked up and asked just how big this dragon was supposed to be. The elf-like woman paused thoughtfully before answering, recalling the ancient legends. She then revealed the terrifying truth, explaining that the dragon was said to be so massive it could completely cover their entire settlement, leaving Rainford to react in sheer horror at its incomprehensible size. Rhea quickly stepped in to defuse the tense situation, reminding Lars that Rain was the one who had saved her, and she had no intention of letting him be hurt. Apologizing, she pleaded with Lars to let the conflict go just this once for her sake, leaving him completely stunned and speechless by her request. Completely taken aback by Rhea's earnest plea, Lars could only stammer out an apology. Seeing his chance to de-escalate, Rainford smiled and politely announced that it was time for them to leave. As they departed, Rhea kindly told him to watch his step, while a defeated Lars managed to utter a quiet, reluctant thank you. However, the fragile truce was instantly broken. As Rainford walked away, Lars's face twisted with contempt, and he muttered a venomous curse under his breath against the damn outsider human. Rainford stood silently, realizing the elves' hatred for humans was deeply ingrained and almost natural given their history. As they watched the man hobble away with his daughter Lulu, Rhea explained that he was Lars, and his hostility was fueled by the fact that he'd been recently mauled by a magical beast while out hunting. Rhea explained that Lars's hostility was likely just frustration from his injuries, since he couldn't move his body properly. She then admitted her own feelings of helplessness, frustrated that she couldn't do anything for him. Her hand tightened into a fist as she revealed her greatest fear, the thought of being powerless to protect her companions if a dragon ever appeared. Her fear quickly gave way to a steely resolve as she declared she would fight the dragon to the very end. Rhea swore that even if she were burned by its breath or had her head crushed, she wasn't afraid to die as long as it was to protect everyone, though her voice faltered, leaving an unspoken doubt hanging in the air. That unspoken doubt was her deepest fear, which she confessed with tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't afraid for herself but for her precious companions, terrified that the people she considered family would disappear just as her parents once did. Her voice trembled as she gave words to her ultimate dread, looking down as she wondered what she would even do if everyone died, leaving her utterly alone once more. Overwhelmed by her dark thoughts, Rhea's strength finally gave out, and she suddenly slumped against him. Rainford's eyes widened in alarm, and he desperately called out her name as he caught her. As he held her steady, Rainford noticed Rhea was bleeding from where she'd clenched her fists in despair. He gently told her not to be so hard on herself and insisted on treating the wound, causing a warm, healing light to glow from his hand as he used his magic to seal the injury. As the massive divine beast's presence settled over the stunned elves, Rhea's eyes darted towards Rainford in disbelief, her voice a mix of shock and confusion as she uttered his name. His concern shifting to the rest of the village, Rainford asked Rhea if Lars was the only one who had been injured. With a worried look, she confirmed that he wasn't, explaining that if they included everyone with both minor and serious wounds, there were quite a few casualties. Hearing this, Rainford's expression hardened as he made a bold request, asking Rhea if it was possible to gather all the injured villagers in one place. Taken aback by the strange demand, a worried Rhea could only ask what he was planning to do. Rainford looked at Rhea with grim determination and asked her to gather everyone in the village who was hurt. Later that night, under the flickering glow of torches, the injured elves assembled in a forest clearing, their collective resentment hanging heavy in the air as they waited for the human to speak. The injured elves grumbled amongst themselves, questioning why the human kid had dragged them out in the middle of the night when their wounds ached the most. They sneered that humans clearly had no common sense, but their bitter complaints were cut short as Rainford took a firm step forward to address them. As their bitter complaints died down, Rainford stood before the hostile crowd of elves and began to speak, offering a sincere apology for summoning them so late at night while they were still recovering from their injuries. Fenrir's sudden appearance only fueled the elves' rage, as one injured villager screamed at Rainford to leave the beast behind and get out. He accused the boy of manipulating Rhea, furiously wishing he was healthy enough to throw him out personally. As other elves joined in, demanding to know his true intentions, a worried Rhea questioned Rainford's plan, but he remained undeterred, simply turning to her with a confident smile and telling her not to worry. With a confident wink, Rainford explained to the baffled Rhea that he simply wanted to solve this little neighborhood issue so they could all get along. His casual description of the tense situation left her completely speechless, only able to stammer in confusion. Standing before the hostile crowd of injured elves, Rainford cleared his throat and formally introduced himself as Rainford Proudlord. He explained that as the eldest son of a baron, he had been officially entrusted by the kingdom with the management of the entire Silver Forest, but his words only stoked their anger. The elves erupted in disbelief and fury, with one venomously telling the filthy human not to get cocky. Rainford calmly acknowledged their anger, but explained that since he was acting under direct orders from the kingdom, he couldn't simply ignore the situation in the forest. His appeal to authority only fueled their fury, as they screamed that they didn't care about human politics and demanded he be thrown out. The hostility quickly escalated, with another elf shouting that they should slice the brat up and make an example out of him for all humans. Rainford calmly acknowledged the elves' deep-seated anger, trying to find common ground. But just as he was about to address the issue, his senses flared, and he realized with a start that someone nearby was casting wind magic. The source of the wind magic suddenly appeared, landing silently in their midst with a soft thud. The hostile elves stared in pure terror at the shadowy beast perched before them, its glowing eyes fixed on the crowd as it let out a low growl. One of the villagers gasped, identifying the creature with a trembling voice as the divine beast, Fenrir. As the elves reeled in terror, Shiro bared his fangs with a deep, menacing growl, his aggression clear. Sensing the danger, Rainford quickly called out his companion's name, trying to regain control of the volatile situation. With the situation escalating, Rainford tried a more disarming approach to calm the terrified elves. He offered a cheerful wink and a thumbs up, reintroducing himself as Rainford Proudlord and casually adding that he was a 26-year-old who was originally from Earth. The elves were utterly baffled by his casual self-introduction amidst the tense standoff. Internally, Rainford simply thought of himself as a cheeky country boy who had received some decent magical talent directly from a goddess, and he began to explain his reasoning for the strange approach. Rather than answer, the ancient dragon unleashed a terrifying earth-shaking roar that filled the air with immense pressure. Despite the overwhelming display of power, Rainford stood his ground, looking up at the colossal beast whose full attention was now fixed solely on him. The full weight of the dragon's presence pressed down on Rainford, who realized with chilling certainty that he had to speak now. He knew that if he didn't, he might not get another chance while he was still breathing. Ignoring Rainford's polite request, the dragon's voice boomed with terrifying impatience, roaring for them to hurry up. The elder elf stared in horror as the dragon's demand became a single, primal command to feed me, and a massive force erupted directly towards the stunned Rainford. But this was no mindless roar. The colossal dragon focused its immense presence on the elven leader, addressing the tiny elder of the elves directly. Its voice thundered across the clearing, declaring that the time had finally come to fulfill an ancient pact, leaving her stunned and speechless. The elder elf's initial shock gave way to a brief moment of recognition as she mumbled about that old thing, but she immediately feigned ignorance, loudly proclaiming to the dragon that she had no idea what it was talking about. The elder elf stood defiantly, shielding Rainford from the colossal beast's immense presence. Unimpressed by her feigned ignorance, the dragon scoffed, cynically questioning how a pact from 2,000 years ago could possibly have been forgotten and completely dismissing her denial. Unmoved by her act, the dragon's voice boomed that it had just felt a massive magical surge in the area, a declaration that left Rainford and the elves standing in stunned, anxious silence. However, Rainford's polite request was met with pure fury. The ancient dragon's patience snapped, and with a deafening roar, it bellowed that it had heard enough jokes for one day. The dragon's voice boomed, declaring that the immense power it sensed was the embodiment of its ancient pact with the elves, and the perfect offering to fulfill it. As the horrifying implication of its words dawned on Rainford, he could only stare in stunned silence. Rainford's worst fear was confirmed in an instant, as the tiny elder of the elves, with a strained and terrified smile, pointed directly at him, stammering that the kid the dragon was looking for was right here. Rainford was frozen in absolute shock, his mind screaming at the elder's blatant betrayal as she offered him up as a sacrifice. The colossal dragon's voice boomed with disdain, questioning if this puny human was truly the promised offering. Horrified, the young elf girl asked the elder if she was serious, but the old woman could only cry out that she had no other choice. Despite its initial scorn, the great beast leaned in for a closer look, letting out a contemplative hum as it inspected Rainford. After a moment of scrutiny, the colossal dragon's voice boomed across the clearing, conceding that the elder elf was correct. It could sense a strange, otherworldly power emanating from the human. The dragon's gaze then focused on the small creature in Rainford's arms, identifying it as a baby Fenrir, and concluding that this must be the source of his otherworldly strength. With the colossal beast's attention now fixed squarely on him, Rainford could only stammer nervously as he tried to speak. Finding his resolve, Rainford looked up at the colossal beast and formally introduced himself as Rainford Proudlord. With a strained yet polite smile, he then added his one humble request. He would really prefer not to be eaten, if that was all right. But Rainford's polite request was met with a deafening roar. The colossal dragon's maw opened wide, its voice thundering as it accused him of daring to break the sacred pact they had made ages ago. Rainford's polite plea was met with an imposing silence, and he could only sweat nervously as he awaited the beast's response. The colossal dragon finally spoke, its voice dripping with utter disdain as it declared it had no interest whatsoever in the petty affairs of tiny creatures like them. But Rainford's polite request was met with a terrifying ultimatum. The colossal dragon loomed over him, its voice dripping with menace as it declared that if he refused to be the offering, it would simply break him before feasting on his body. With no time to react, Rainford could only watch in horror as the dragon lunged forward. A single terrifying thought consumed him: if he took that attack head-on, he was dead. His fear became reality in an instant as a cataclysmic force slammed into him, the impact so powerful it felt like the world itself was being torn apart. As the world dissolved into a blur of speed and crushing force, the sensation was chillingly familiar to Rainford. It was the same brutal impact from the truck that had ended his first life, and a single, terrifying thought screamed through his mind: am I going to die again? His defense spell barely held as the sheer force of the dragon's attack slammed into him, launching Rainford violently backwards through the forest. Crashing to a halt amidst the trees, Rainford groaned in pain, but a wave of relief washed over him. He was thankful he'd managed to get his defense spell up just in time, though he still trembled at the sheer, overwhelming power of the dragon's attack. But as the overwhelming force sent him flying, a horrifying sense of déjà vu washed over Rainford. His mind flashed back to his previous life, recognizing the bone-shattering impact as the very same feeling he experienced the moment he was killed by a truck. As his world faded to black, a single, horrifying question echoed through Rainford's fading consciousness: was he really going to die again? As consciousness slipped away, memories of the new life he had built flashed before his eyes. He saw the successful dams and canals bringing bountiful harvests, and recalled the pride of being accepted by the kingdom. Rainford lamented all the things he still wanted to try, but more than anything, he mourned losing this new life, because living with magic and the people he'd met was just so damn fun. As his consciousness faded, Rainford's thoughts drifted to his beloved sister, Ellie, believing with a heavy heart that his time in this world was finally over. But the end never came. Rainford slowly opened his eyes, finding himself on the forest floor surprisingly alive. As his vision cleared, he saw a massive, divine beast lying beside him, and he realized with a shock that it was his loyal companion, Shiro. Stunned into silence, Rainford could only stammer his friend's name, completely bewildered by his sudden and immense transformation. Still stammering his companion's name, Rainford was met with a gentle nuzzle from the colossal beast. The creature let out a soft, affectionate rumble, as if trying to say his name, which only solidified the impossible truth, sending Rainford spiraling from disbelief into a state of pure, wide-eyed shock. Overcome with grief and gratitude, Rainford buried his face in Shiro's thick fur, clutching the loyal companion who had sacrificed everything to save him. As the terrifying moment replayed in his mind, Rainford understood exactly what had happened. When the dragon's blast sent him flying, Shiro had thrown his own body underneath to cushion the devastating impact. Even now, as the loyal beast lay battered and broken, Rainford could tell his friend's only concern was still for his safety. Rainford's hand trembled as he rested it on Shiro's battered body, his voice cracking as he whispered that his friend was an idiot. A tear then dropped onto the matted fur as Rainford choked back a sob, repeating how incredibly stupid Shiro was for sacrificing himself. The sheer weight of Shiro's selfless act finally crashed down on Rainford. As tears streamed uncontrollably down his face, he was completely overwhelmed by the realization that his friend had endured everything just to protect him. His grief turning to resolve, Rainford gently told Shiro to rest, promising that he would be the one to take the dragon down. Getting to his feet, he charged head on towards the colossal beast looming in the distance, knowing that after everything Shiro had done for him, there was no way he was chickening out now. But as Rainford was lost in his grief, a powerful voice suddenly echoed in his mind, snapping him out of his despair. It questioned what he was mourning for, firmly declaring that a young Fenrir wouldn't die from something so trivial. Rainford's sorrow instantly twisted into raw fury. While Shiro's words had indeed fired him back up, he angrily dismissed the thought, realizing that wasn't the point as he began to conjure a powerful orb of magic. He hurled the condensed sphere of mana forward, screaming a curse at the dragon responsible for Shiro's pain. The sphere of pure magical energy connected with a thunderous boom, slamming directly into the side of the dragon's head and sending a shockwave through the air. The magical explosion slammed into the colossal dragon, making it stumble from the raw power. But watching from above, Rainford knew instantly that while the hit landed, it wasn't nearly enough to bring the creature down. As the dust settled, the colossal dragon steadied itself, its voice rumbling with an ancient power as it acknowledged the boy's attack, calling it impressive for a mere human child. But the dragon's arrogance was short-lived as its crystalline barrier shattered under the force of a new attack, causing the beast to cry out in disbelief. This overwhelming power came from Rainford, who stood with grim determination, unleashing a condensed sphere of pure magical energy from the palm of his hand. As grief for Shiro turned to rage, Rainford recalled his past victory over the arrogant tax inspector Vincent. He had overwhelmed the knight with such intense heat magic that Vincent simply collapsed from exhaustion. Channeling that same indomitable power, Rainford focused on his new target, vowing that no matter how tough the dragon's scales were, This next attack would hit with devastating force. With a final surge, Rainford unleashed a concentrated sphere of pure, searing heat that shot through the air toward the colossal beast. As the attack was launched, the ground beneath him erupted, the sheer force of the magic creating a massive shockwave that sent him flying backwards. But his devastating blast never reached its target, as the dragon instantly conjured a colossal wall of earth that cracked and splintered but ultimately absorbed the full impact. Despite the recoil from his own magic, Rainford stood his ground, a determined look on his bruised face as he swore he would not let the creature harm his people or his home. Staring defiantly at the colossal beast, Rainford's voice dripped with cold fury as he promised the dragon it would pay for every bit of destruction, vowing to make damn sure of it.